There are moments in history that don't announce themselves with sirens. They arrive quietly, in a speech, a rebuttal, a press conference where a former central banker calmly tells the most powerful nation on earth, no, not this time. What is unfolding right now between Canada and the United States is not a trade dispute. It is not a diplomatic misunderstanding. It is the visible edge of a structural shift that has been building for decades, and the people who understand money, power, and consequence are watching very carefully, because when the closest allies in the world start drawing lines, the rest of the global order takes notice. Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, stood before the world at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and delivered a speech that reverberated far beyond the Alpine conference halls. Without once naming Donald Trump directly, he condemned what he called economic coercion by great powers against smaller nations. He declared that the rules-based international order, the framework that has governed global trade and diplomacy since 1945, is actively fading. He urged what he described as middle powers to rise, to assert themselves, and to build a new order grounded in their own values. The world paid attention. The speech drew widespread praise, and it upstaged Trump at one of the most prestigious gatherings of global economic power. Trump responded from the same stage the following day. He said Canada should be grateful. He said Canada receives what he called freebies from the United States. He said directly and by name that Canada lives because of the United States. And he told Carney to remember that. Carney returned home and responded publicly. He said he had told the president personally that he meant every word he said in Davos. He told his parliament that almost nothing about Washington is normal anymore, and he committed Canada to doubling its exports to countries other than the United States, a strategic pivot of enormous consequence. Trump then threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if Canada moved toward any trade arrangement with China, warning that Canada would not be allowed to serve as what he called a drop-off port for Chinese goods entering the United States. Carney rejected the premise entirely, stating that Canada has no interest in a free trade deal with Beijing. Two leaders, two completely different visions of how the world should work, and both of them know exactly what they are doing. To understand what is actually happening here, you have to step back from the headlines and look at the deeper architecture of incentives, history, and power. Mark Carney is not a typical politician. He is a former governor of the Bank of Canada. He is a former governor of the Bank of England. He navigated both institutions through crises: the 2008 financial collapse in Canada and Brexit in Britain. He understands sovereign debt, currency dynamics, capital flows, and the long-term consequences of economic dependency. When he speaks about trade diversification, he is not offering campaign rhetoric. He is outlining a structural diagnosis and a practical response. Canada's economic dependency on the United States is one of the most extreme bilateral trade relationships in the developed world. Roughly 75% of Canada's exports go to the United States. That is not a partnership between equals, that is a structural vulnerability. And every serious economist, every central banker, and every long-horizon strategist in Canada has known for decades that this dependency is a risk. Not just an inconvenience, but an existential lever that any American administration can pull at will. Trump is pulling it now, and Carney's response is not anger. It is architecture. He is not simply pushing back against a tariff threat. He is beginning to build the infrastructure of an alternative, one that reduces Canada's exposure over time and strengthens its negotiating position by demonstrating that it has other options. Here is what most coverage misses: the 25% tariffs the Trump administration imposed on Canadian goods and the threats of further escalation are not primarily about trade deficits. The bilateral trade relationship between the United States and Canada is deeply integrated. The two economies share supply chains that cross the border multiple times for a single finished product. A car manufactured in Michigan contains Canadian steel and aluminum. A Canadian oil pipeline feeds American refineries. The integrated North American industrial base was built over decades precisely because deep interdependence was good for both countries. Tariffs in this context do not just hurt Canada. They raise costs for American manufacturers, American consumers, and American workers. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, Goldman Sachs, and the Tax Foundation have all produced analyses projecting that broad tariffs on Canada and Mexico increase prices for American households and reduce employment in American manufacturing. These are not partisan conclusions. They are the logical outputs of models built on the mechanics of supply chains and price transmission. So if the tariffs hurt both sides, why impose them? Because leverage is only useful if you're willing to demonstrate that you'll use it, even at cost to yourself. This is not economics. This is political theater designed to signal dominance. And the audience is not just Canada. It is every country watching whether America's closest neighbor will comply or resist. Let's follow the money and the power. In the short term, certain domestic American industries benefit from tariff protection. Steel producers, aluminum manufacturers, and industries shielded from foreign competition. These are concentrated industries with concentrated political power, and their support is worth something to any administration seeking to consolidate its industrial policy narrative. But the costs are diffuse. American consumers pay higher prices across a wide range of goods. American manufacturers, who depend on integrated supply chains, face higher input costs. American farmers lose market access when Canada retaliates, and Canada has retaliated with precisely targeted countermeasures on American agricultural exports, a strategy learned from the 2018 to 2019 trade conflict. Canadian retaliatory tariffs in that period focused specifically on goods produced in politically sensitive American states: orange juice from Florida, bourbon from Kentucky, motorcycles from Wisconsin. The targeting was surgical. It was designed to maximize political pain at the district level. Canada loses in the short term as well. Its exports become more expensive in the American market. Some sectors face genuine disruption. The Canadian dollar weakens, which has complicated effects. It makes Canadian exports cheaper in other markets, but it also reduces the purchasing power of Canadian households for imported goods, including American ones. But here is where the analysis gets interesting. If Canada successfully diversifies its export markets, if it builds trade relationships with the European Union, with Asian economies, with South American partners, it gradually reduces its dependency on the United States. That reduction in dependency is itself a reduction in American leverage. Every percentage point of Canadian exports that flows to a non-American destination is a percentage point of bargaining power that the United States loses in future negotiations. China is watching all of this with great interest. Beijing has actively encouraged Canada to reduce its alignment with Washington. It has offered trade engagement. It has dangled the prospect of a market of 1.4 billion people as an alternative to the American market. Carney has said clearly that Canada is not pursuing a free trade deal with China, but he has also committed to visiting Beijing, and he has made it plain that Canada will seek to expand its commercial relationships wherever it can. The European Union benefits from this dynamic as well. A Canada seeking to diversify is a Canada more willing to deepen its existing trade architecture with Europe. The comprehensive economic and trade agreement between Canada and the EU already exists. It just needs to be activated more fully. American corporations with integrated North American supply chains lose from prolonged disruption. Automakers, energy companies, aerospace manufacturers, these are industries built on the assumption of frictionless cross-border commerce. Their lobbying power is considerable, and their interests are directly opposed to escalating tariff barriers. This creates internal pressure within the American political system itself, a counterweight to the protectionist impulse. History offers several instructive parallels, and none of them fully resolves in favor of economic coercion. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 is the most cited example, and for good reason. Passed at the onset of the Great Depression, it raised tariffs on thousands of imported goods in an attempt to protect American industry. The result was a cascade of retaliatory tariffs from trading partners, a collapse in global trade volume, and a deepening of the depression across multiple continents. It did not protect American jobs. It destroyed them, along with the jobs of people in countries that had been buying American exports. A more recent parallel is the 2018 to 2019 trade conflict between the United States and China. That confrontation produced some shifts in supply chains, some reshoring of specific manufacturing categories, and considerable uncertainty in global markets. It also produced something else, a massive acceleration of Chinese investment in domestic semiconductor manufacturing, electric vehicle production, and advanced technology development. The tariff pressure that was meant to weaken China's industrial capacity instead provided the political justification for Beijing to invest trillions of yuan in strategic industries. A decade from now, those investments may prove to be among the most consequential industrial policy decisions of the 21st century. The British Empire's relationship with its dominions in the early 20th century offers another lens. As Britain declined in economic primacy relative to the United States and Germany, its ability to maintain favorable terms with Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth nations weakened. Those nations did not abandon Britain, but they began to build relationships and capacities that reduced their dependency. The process was gradual, often invisible in any individual year, but unmistakable across decades. What Carney is doing now has echoes of that gradual repositioning, it is not a dramatic severance. It is a quiet, deliberate diversification, the kind that only becomes visible when you look back across years and ask, when did Canada stop organizing its economic future around American patronage? Markets do not like uncertainty. They can price risk. They cannot price the unknown, and what the current confrontation between Canada and the United States introduces into the global system is precisely that. Uncertainty about the reliability of bilateral economic arrangements that have been taken as given for generations. The Canadian dollar has experienced downward pressure in this environment, which has mixed effects. It makes Canadian commodities, oil, natural gas, lumber, minerals, agricultural products, cheaper in global markets priced in US dollars. That actually benefits Canadian exporters in the short run, even as it reduces household purchasing power domestically. The Bank of Canada faces a complex balancing act between managing inflation, supporting growth, and navigating the currency effects of ongoing trade friction. American markets have shown sensitivity to tariff announcements as well. The periods of escalation have corresponded with equity market volatility, particularly in sectors with deep cross-border exposure, automotive, energy, materials. The market is effectively pricing in two scenarios simultaneously, one in which the confrontation is resolved through negotiation, and one in which it escalates into something more structurally disruptive. The global impact runs deeper than bilateral trade statistics. Other nations are observing the United States' relationship with its closest, most integrated trading partner and drawing conclusions about the reliability of American commitments. If the United States is willing to impose punishing tariffs on Canada, a country that shares the longest peaceful border in the world, that has fought alongside American soldiers in every major conflict of the last century, that shares a language and a cultural fabric with the northern half of the continent, then what does that say about the security of trade arrangements with countries that are less aligned? Japan, South Korea, Germany, and other advanced economy allies have noted the dynamic. They are quietly reassessing the extent to which their economic security depends on American goodwill. They are investing in redundancy, in alternative trade relationships, alternative technology partnerships, alternative supply chains. This is not a crisis. It is a slow, rational adjustment to a new reality. One of the most consequential investors in the world has observed this pattern over decades of watching how protectionism actually plays out in practice. Without entering political territory, he has made his position clear. When great economies turn trade into a weapon, the initial damage is absorbed by the target, but the long-term damage accrues to the aggressor. Because the world does not stand still, it reroutes, and when it reroutes around you, the rerouting becomes permanent. His framework is elegantly simple. Always ask, and then what? What happens after the tariff? Who pays it? Where do goods flow next? What do the trading partners do with the next decade? And the decade after that? These are not abstract questions. They are the architecture of competitive advantage or its erosion. Let us think through the plausible futures with clear eyes. In the first scenario, negotiations produce a new framework. Canada makes targeted concessions on border security, energy pricing, or other issues the American administration identifies as priorities. The United States reduces or eliminates the tariff threat. The relationship stabilizes, but on different terms, terms that reflect a more transactional American posture. In this scenario, the short-term disruption ends, but something more subtle and lasting has changed. Canada has learned that its dependency is a vulnerability, and it will spend the next decade methodically reducing it. The relationship survives, but it is never quite the same. In the second scenario, tariffs escalate and become prolonged. Canada accelerates its trade diversification. The integrated North American supply chains begin to fracture. Businesses on both sides of the border absorb the costs and make structural adjustments, relocating production, finding new suppliers, building new commercial relationships. This is the most expensive path for both economies, and it produces the most lasting changes. Some of those changes, increased Canadian economic self-reliance, deeper Canadian integration with European and Asian markets, may ultimately strengthen Canada's long-term position, even as they impose short-term costs. In the third scenario, and this is the one most observers underestimate, domestic American political pressure reshapes the policy from within. American manufacturers, farmers, and consumers who bear the costs of prolonged trade disruption generate political pressure that eventually outweighs the political benefit of the protectionist posture. In the 2018 to 2019 trade conflict, this dynamic played out partly in the renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA, which resolved many of the contested issues while allowing both sides to claim a form of victory. A similar resolution is possible here if the political calculus shifts. What is almost certainly not possible is a return to the pre-Trump North American economic relationship as it existed before 2016. That world, characterized by relatively seamless integration, mutual reliance, and the implicit assumption that economic coercion between the two countries was off the table, has been replaced by something more explicit, more transactional, and more uncertain. Canada will not forget these episodes. Neither will the Canadian electorate, which has shown in its support for Carney's firm stance that it regards American pressure as something to be resisted rather than accommodated. The deeper structural consequence is this. The United States is teaching its closest allies that proximity to American power is a source of risk as well as benefit. That lesson, once learned, reshapes how countries organize their economic futures. It takes years to fully manifest, but it does manifest, and when it does, the United States finds itself with fewer reliable partners, reduced leverage over nations that have built alternative relationships, and a global order less organized around American preferences. This is the paradox at the heart of economic coercion. It can produce short-term compliance, but it produces long-term independence. Pressure creates the motivation for exactly the diversification that makes countries less susceptible to future pressure. The more you squeeze, the more they build the infrastructure to avoid being squeezed again. There is a principle that runs beneath all of this, one that any serious student of history, economics, or human behavior eventually encounters. Power is not static, it is relational. It exists only in the dynamic between actors who recognize it and respond to it. When a great power treats its closest allies as dependents rather than partners, it may achieve compliance in the immediate moment. But it also activates something essential in human nature. The drive for autonomy, for dignity, for the right to determine one's own future. Canada has not declared war, it has not severed ties, it has done something quieter and in the long run, more consequential. It has said clearly, we are capable of charting our own course. Mark Carney is a man trained in the language of compound interest. He understands that small adjustments, compounded over years, produce enormous outcomes. The diversification of Canadian trade relationships is not going to happen overnight. Neither is the reduction of Canadian dependency on the American market. But the direction has been set, the signal has been sent, and the world's other middle powers, watching from Brussels, Canberra, Tokyo, Seoul, and dozens of capitals beyond, are drawing their own conclusions about what kind of world they are now living in. Warren Buffett has spent a lifetime asking a single question about every decision, every policy, every market dynamic he encounters. And then what? It is the most underused question in economics and in governance. Tariffs go up, and then what? Allies feel coerced, and then what? The rules-based order phrase, and then what? The answers to those questions are not mysterious. They are written in the history of every empire that mistook the compliance of its partners for loyalty, every economy that mistook tactical leverage for durable power. But the world is not ending. Trade will continue. Canada and the United States will almost certainly find some version of accommodation, but the underlying architecture of their relationship has shifted, quietly, consequentially, in ways that will be studied decades from now.